Welcome to Cryptic Curiosity. We're your hosts,
Amber
and JoJo, and today we are going to be discussing the Salem Witch trials and
the 80's Satanic Panic.
In 1692 and 1693, the Salem Witch trials occurred in Massachusetts. More than 200 people were accused of practicing witchcraft, aka the devil's magic. Around 20 of the 200 people were executed. The colony admitted the trials were a mistake and compensated the families of the convicted.
What I've never understood about the Salem Witch trials is it really was some little girls that were bored with their nanny and pretty much made up a story and made up symptoms and pointed fingers at people, accusing them of doing that to them.
Mm-hmm.
And things like birthmarks and freckles and things like that were like, oh, they afflicted me. No, you had that since the day you were born. But nobody
I did no such thing. Many centuries ago, practicing Christians believed that the devil could give witches the power to harm others. A witchcraft craze went through Europe from the 1300s to the end of 1600s. Tens of thousands of people were accused of witchcraft and were executed.
So was that a mentality that was like brought over here? That whole witch hunt mentality?
I believe so. In 1689, English rulers William and Mary started a war with France in American colonies. In 1692, Reverend Paris, daughter of Elizabeth, and niece Abigail Williams, they began throwing things, making strange sounds, and putting themselves into weird positions. And one of the local doctors said that it was supernatural that was causing that.
How did they know it was supernatural? I mean, was it positions that she couldn't like normally twist into?
It doesn't say. The only thing I can keep thinking of is it from The Exorcist where she's like in a crab position?
Yeah, where she crab crawls down the stairs.
Yeah, that's what that makes me think of, but
you know, that's a deleted scene that they added back in when they re-released it. It wasn't in the original movie.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. Yeah, that's what that makes me think of. And on February 29th, 3 girls were blamed for afflicting them. The women were interrogated for several days, starting March 1st, 1692. 2 of the women said they were innocent, but one confessed and said, quote, "The devil came to me and bid me serve him," end quote. Now that...
Well, did she?
Many more accusations followed. But the charge that really concerned that community was the charge of Martha Corey, because she was a loyal member of the church in Salem Village. So they thought if she could be a witch, then it was possible that anybody could be a witch.
What was their definition of being a witch? Just acting strangely? Well, shit,
yeah, basically.
That's every woman a week before her period.
Right.
You gotta kind of take yourself back to that time, though. Now, these people are in a completely brand new place. It's not even the same environment that they're used to. They come over here with their set religious beliefs, and all around them is people that have a completely different culture and completely different religious structure. I mean, it's still monotheistic where it's one God, but native more religious practice or spiritual practices probably would have looked like witchcraft to them. So if they went to their native neighbors and was like, you know, my whole family isn't feeling good, is there any like medicines that grow wild? That back then would have been witchcraft. Learning how to use the local plants. So, which is boggling to me that they didn't see the benefit in learning their new environment and how to how to benefit or how to use its benefits. But that back then was witchcraft. Just like learning how to use aspirin, something that was here but wasn't where they were from. Or there's lots of medicinal plants that grow native everywhere, or them praying would look different than the Christian prayer. Native American prayers are chants, and that would be complete. And if somebody was around that and like hummed that or something like that, they would probably like, oh, that's strange. And they would know, because if you know anything about early American settlers, their houses were like right next to each other. So you could literally like lean in and be in your neighbor's house. So you knew everybody's business, so you would know if there was even the slightest bit of outside influence that would be strange. So by that definition, you could finger point anybody.
Right.
Be like, oh, she didn't shit right today. She's a witch. She used the outhouse today 4 times instead of 3.
Oh, jeez, I'd be screwed. Magistrates questioned Sarah Good's 4-year-old daughter. Her answers were construed as a confession.
Yeah, because a 4-year-old's gonna know
exactly what's going on. Well, the first case brought to court was Bridget Bishop. She was an older woman who was known for being a gossip and being promiscuous.
Oh, so Bridget.
She's a witch for that.
She's a witch because she liked to talk shit and because she liked to have...
She claimed her innocence, saying that she was as innocent as an unborn child. And on June 10th, she was found guilty and was the first person hanged on Gallows Hill.
That's a place I'd like to go. It's not like they don't... What I've watched or seen on like documentaries about Salem is they have an idea where that was, but they're not 100% sure, and there's a fucking playground there. And it's...
There's a what?
A playground. Like a old kid's playground. That's what's there.
Oh.
And, can you imagine going swinging on the swings, and all of a sudden you hear, because a lot of times hauntings is more what you hear and what you feel. You hear the sound of that door opening.
Oh my god, that gives me the chills. That would freak me out.
About Salem, that always got me, is it really was gossip that led to people being killed.
That's crazy to think about, because could you imagine? I mean, now, everybody is always gossiping.
And it seemed to be okay to gossip that this person was a heretic or a witch or marked by the devil or whatever their charge was. That wasn't considered gossip. Something as simple as, hey, I heard the preacher is sick, could be construed as gossip, and you could, that could be a witchcraft sign to them. It's unreal.
Cotton Mather wrote a letter imploring the court to allow spectral evidence, testimony about dreams and visions. I've never heard of that before.
That's reliable evidence. In a dream, you did this, so you'll really be doing it. That's kind of like, it'd be kind of like being, how women wake up from dreams that their husbands are cheating, and you wake up and slap the shit out of them because they did something in a dream. You're mad for the day. Imagine being hung for that.
It says 5 people were hanged in July, 5 more in August, and 8 in September. October 3rd, Increase Mather, which I think is the son, denounced the use of such evidence. Governor Phipps prohibited further arrests, released the accused witches.
You laid on the ones that you hung.
Right? Phipps ended up pardoning all who were in prison on witchcraft charges. Unfortunately, the damage was already done. 19 were hanged on Gallows Hill. A 71-year-old man was pressed to death with heavy stones.
Yeah, that's...
I don't think I've heard of that.
That may be... there's a ghost story in Salem, which, by the way, I don't ever want to run into this particular ghost, because supposedly if you see him, you die, within a few days. And like wanders around Salem. I guess people that had actually seen him. I don't know if he's got to look at you or you just got to see him and you're done. But that was one of the ghost stories that I watched from Salem, where somehow it was a man that was killed associated with the witch trials. It may have been that guy. I'm not sure. If any of you guys listening know, put it in the comments of who the ghost was, if it was the same guy that was crushed or not.
Jeez, that just sounds horrible.
Well, being hung doesn't exactly sound like
yeah,
a
that
roller
sounds
coaster ride.
It's both horrible.
And they did other things too, like the dunking. A lot of women died from that, where they would dunk them in water repeatedly. Where if they floated, they were witches. Well,
Really?
us big girls are a little bit more buoyant than little tiny girls, so that's not fair.
I don't think I've heard of that one either. I may have seen it before, but I don't know. Well, obviously, on a movie or something.
Yeah, I think there's been, 200 and some years or more
a long time
since this happened. So there's...
I think they said like 300? 200 300?
Yeah, makes sense.
Several people died in jail, and around 200 people were accused of practicing the devil's magic. Judges like Samuel Sewall publicly admitted error and guilt. January 14, 1697, the General Court ordered a day of fasting and soul-searching. In 1702, the court declared that the trials were unlawful. In 1711, the colony passed a bill that restores the rights and good names of the accused. In 1957, Massachusetts formally apologized for what happened in 1692.
I guess better late than never.
Yeah, right. In August 1992, for the 300-year anniversary, Nobel laureate Elie Wiesel dedicated the Witch Trials Memorial in Salem. And the Peabody Essex Museum houses the original court documents. The Salem Witch Museum attests to the public's enthrallment with the 1692 hysteria.
Another thing I found a little interesting about the Salem Witch Trials, and just my casual research of it through the years, a lot of the people that were accused and a lot of people that were hanged were actually very devout in the church. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the accusations were a little bit more political. Like, there was one guy that was hanged that he was a prominent person in the community. Like, he owned land, his family wasn't hungry, been a very devout in the church. And he was named as a witch or warlock, whatever you would call the male version of it. And he was hanged, and his family... It was pretty much they were trying to take the land and what he owned away from his family. So some of it seemed more politically driven, like get your daughter, go get your daughter to accuse this person of being a witch, because it's got to be a teenage girl that's doing it, and make her show a fit of hysteria before she does it.
Right.
That's what I just picture of hearing all the stories of what was going on, is that it was really, like, in the first 3 girls, I think 2 of the girls, they were the pastor's daughters or something like that.
Yeah.
So they're high members of the church, or highly thought of in the community, or well off in the community, and let's go after them and take their shit.
Pretty fucked up.
People are
awful.
Forget what goes bump in the night. Forget that. That's not the scariest part of being alive. That's the interesting part of being alive. The scariest part of being alive is other motherfuckers.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them. There's a lot of people that are, a lot of one type of person that believes they're right above reproach, which is what I think what happened in Salem, is they got an idea in their head that I don't know when people would be listening to a bunch of 12, 13-year-old girls about knowing about what witchcraft is to begin with. That would have been my first question. How do you know, little girl?
Right.
And there was the whole Tituba part of the story where the first girls that started naming people would, or it was almost like they got caught with their, I guess you would consider her a nanny, but she's not getting paid wages. That was pretty much what her job was to take care of the girls in like the house. So she would have been like, she was a slave, but for reference, her responsibilities would be like a housekeeper or a nanny.
Yeah.
Or both. But she was teaching the girls. I don't know if it was like voodoo practices or something like that, or just like divination, but from where she was from. You know, they were stolen from Africa. They had their own belief structure. They're not going to necessarily stop that just because they're here. They're just not going to do it in front of,
Yeah.
in front of the people that they don't want to see it. But she was showing the children, like, divination with eggs and stuff like that. And there was a story that what really started it was she got caught. And this whole play up of she's a witch and the devil was telling us that it was this person and this person and this person that is afflicted and is afflicting people. It was a way for the girls to get out of being in trouble for doing something they weren't supposed to be, and probably saving Tituba's life. That was kind of like that. It would have been to save her life, because if they would have found out what she was doing, they would have killed her.
Yeah.
And the girls would have been in major trouble back then of participating in something like that. And it just grew from that lie and kept growing. And what a lot of people forget is it wasn't just one town that this was happening in. It happened in the surrounding towns too, where this frenzy carried over. Not a time I would have did well in, because they would have hung my ass in a minute.
Yeah, me too. I don't think I would have lasted very long.
I talk back a lot.
Same.
And when things problem. When things don't make sense, I ask questions that wasn't allowed. You stay in the kitchen. You stay in the bedroom and in the kitchen. Your job is to cook and make babies, and that's it. There's other supposed accounts of where girls were saying that they were seeing certain people in town meeting the devil in the woods. Don't you think the devil's got more important shit to do to be meeting fucking teenage girls in the woods?
You would think that.
Be a little bit more concerned with, I don't know. Who knows? But in my head, the devil's probably a lot more like Lucifer on that TV show, where he really doesn't give a fuck about us. He finds us entertaining. It just allows us to fuck ourselves over, pretty much. That's kind of the way I think about it.
He finds great joy in it.
I loved that show. the most blasphemous show ever created.
My husband likes it too. I think I've only seen a couple episodes of it though.
Oh my god,
but I know it's good. I don't know. I never watched it.
I laughed so hard, and that's probably going to be something I have to explain to God in the end. Is why the fuck were you all into this show? Good writing.
It was so funny.
Did you see it? I thought they portrayed you well. But this entire subject would have been considered blasphemy, even talking about it or joking about it. So I found an event in history that we lived through. Did you know that we lived through a panic?
No, I did not.
So in the 80's, there was a phenomenon that happened called the Satanic Panic. What happened was the Christian moral majority had driven the media to create this narrative that the devil was not only real, but he was walking the earth and he was causing things to happen, and we all needed to be worried about Satanists and Satanism in our homes, and our children being abducted by satanic cults. And a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about, you're probably going to remember, but didn't actually connect that it was part of one big thing. To make everything make sense, kind of got to go back in history a little bit. Give you a little history on Satanism so you kind of see the path and what culminated to make this even plausible in people's minds. So Satanism became official, or didn't become official as far as a church, until 1966. It was established by Anton LaVey. He was the author of the Satanic Bible. Now, music has always been linked to Satan since the Middle Ages. There's a musical interval of a tritone or diminished fifth that's referred to as the devil's chord or the devil in music. And in medieval times, it was banned by the Roman Catholic Church. There were a few composers in that time that did use that interval or that tone, and it was used to kind of symbolize the devil. Like, good example of, I don't know if this is an example of the diminished tone. If anybody does know, let me know. But you remember the story of Peter and the Wolf when we were kids, where each instrument signified a different character in the story?
I don't remember that story.
You don't remember that?
No.
Well, anyway, you were the only child in the 80's that wasn't subject to that. The tone was used as a character in the music composition, so it was more like a character in a story, not really pushing like Satanism or anything like that. Later on, the blues got intermingled with Satanism. It was regarded as the devil or satanic profanity. The blues.
The blues?
The blues.
I like blues.
Me too. A lot. Like, a lot. A lot of people, well, history kind of leads to the fact that it was also a way to demonize black people, because a lot of blues musicians in the time were black musicians. So it was still that mentality of us versus them, and the way people thought back then. Or it's inconceivable now to think that people would think of black people or African American people of being lower as far as human beings, but at that time they really did think that, and hence the separate drinking fountains and all that good stuff. That's kind of the time frame we're talking about, 50's, 40's, 30's, where it wasn't like it is now. You weren't allowed to mix, and black people were demonized. A story that came out of that was a musician, Robert Johnson. Supposedly he was just an average guitarist and disappeared for a few weeks, came back and was masterful. Could play way better than he did. So the story was that he went to Highway 49 and 61, where they cross in Mississippi, and exchanged his soul for the instrument. Pretty much everybody everybody thinks it is what it is. It's a religious cautionary tale that if you go looking for the devil, I guess you're going to find it. Pretty much is, I think, the moral of that story. I think that's where they were going with that anyway. But this kind of gives a little bit of a history of the moral majority or conservative majority, maybe, of the time, setting precedents of influencing popular culture and demonizing it to fit their narrative. At that point in time, they wanted separate people to be separated. So to feed that narrative, this man couldn't possibly have just disappeared for a few weeks and focused on his craft and got better. He sold the soul to the devil. Stories like that, and also just what was happening in history. The invention of the television, where you could not only hear but see things that all at once the entire country could see the same thing at the same time.
Yeah.
Think about that as far as like historical concepts of, you're sitting there watching the news and it's in the 60's and you're watching the president in Texas wave with his pretty wife, and you're sitting there with drinking your coffee and you see his head just explode all over the back of that Lincoln. Going from never seeing something like that to everybody seeing it at once. And still culminating, even further as far as the media influence and the TV of everybody being told the same thing, or stories traveling faster with the invention of the TV. Serial killers were also starting to be sensationalized, where people were starting to be aware that there was people, the boogeyman's real, and this is what the dude looks like. I think about people like DeSalvo, John Norman Collins, who was the Ypsilanti Ripper. He was a serial killer in Michigan in the 60s. We'll probably do a podcast and talk about him, because that was a pretty interesting case. Also, Richard Speck happened in that time. So the country as a whole is being introduced all at the same time to some pretty dark imagery and the realization that the boogeyman's real and he looks like your husband. So then that was the 60s. Move on into the 70s, and you've got the Manson family, the Zodiac Killer, Gacy, Bundy, Son of Sam, Hillside Strangler, Jonestown, which was a religious cult that went to South America, and the leader ended up killing most of the people. So the moral majority still pushing that narrative. All of this evil is happening. Well, the devil must be here, right? I mean, all of these things were happening back to back to back, so it probably did seem like the world was ending, that all of this stuff was, that the world's going to hell in the handbasket, all these people are monsters killing people.
Yeah.
Truth is, it wasn't that these people all of a sudden emerged in the 70s, it's just that there was technology at the time where everybody was able to be made aware of it. So in the background of all of this, remember, you've got the Satanic Church started in the 60s. So you've got this church emerging, starting and being actually looked at as a church in the United States. Because remember, guys, it doesn't matter if you agree with the religion or not, they're still allowed to worship whatever they want, because you live here. But that still was a part of that drive, and to kind of push the narrative more that the church, that it's been made a church now. It was making people more popular, like Alistair Crowley. People, if you guys are unfamiliar with who Alistair Crowley is, you probably have heard his work and not even realized it. You ever watched A House of a Thousand Corpses? The scene where the girl's being lowered into the ground and there's something playing in the background, the "Bury Me in a Nameless Grave." That's an Alistair Crowley poem. So he was a Satanist, satanic poet, quite famous one. So with all this stuff happening and being in national media and everybody seeing it all the time, there started to emerge this subculture that was kind of accepting the darkness that was being portrayed all around them. And it was starting to come out in like rock music. So you have Alistair Crowley actually on a Beatles LP cover for Sgt. Pepper. You've got the Rolling Stones with songs like Sympathy for the Devil. Also Led Zeppelin kind of got pulled into this whole era of, or being linked to Alistair Crowley and Satanism. Jimmy Page, who's the guitarist for Led Zeppelin, he's not a Satanist, but he does follow Alistair Crowley's philosophy of personal liberation, whatever that means. Probably how they caught the attention of evangelist Paul Crouch, that claimed by playing the group's track Stairway to Heaven backwards, a voice would be heard saying, "Here's to my sweet Satan, he will give those with him 666. The claim, they said, was purely coincidence, kind of a creepy coincidence that if it actually does say that. I think the subculture was also, people were being driven to like movies like The Exorcist. The cultural influence of The Exorcist really should be a podcast all on its own about creepy shit, because it really did drive people into believing more that you really could invite a demon into your basement and your daughter would be affected by it. You've also got the Amityville story and the DeFeo murders that happened before the whole Amityville story. Movies like Last House on the Left, the Halloween franchise, and most slasher film franchises started in the late 70s. So you've got this culture accepting the darkness that's going on and being like, okay, this is how it's going to be. Our art is going to reflect that. This freaked out the fucking Christian moral majority. They're like, not only is the devil here, but he is in everybody's backyard. Do you see this craziness that's going on TV? Fucking, they were not having it. So it was actually like a conscious decision that they did this. You get to the 80s. You know, the 80s brought in a lot of cool shit, like me and Jolene.
The coolest.
The 80s was kind of a culmination of the moral majority, like, freaking out. Like, we've got to do something. This is, this is the holy war. I laugh, but that's probably what it did feel like to them. If you put yourself, probably what it was, that it really was this good versus evil thing. So, all this imagery is satanic. You've got bands with pentagrams, on their album covers. You've got satanic poet Alistair Crowley.
That doesn't help when they have that stuff, though, on their covers.
And you got to think, there actually are satanic metal bands. There are. That is a thing, that they really are, and that's how they make their money. There was, I don't know if you remember this TV evangelist, but you remember Jerry Falwell? Probably remember his name from The People versus Larry Flint. So if you don't know who Jerry Falwell was, he was a TV evangelist in the 80s that was very popular with the moral majority. So with him being this huge name, went up against the porn king Larry Flint, did not win, by the way. And he's a name, so he's influencing other evangelists to drive this narrative that Satan and satanic cults are all around us and they want your children. They even put out a description of what satanic cults would be looking for to abduct your children. And it's like, who does that? I mean, really? But they did. The whole idea was to scare people away from paying attention to that and, making it popular. They didn't want any of that popular. They wanted the nice Norman Rockwell painting. That's what we want people to view as normal, not Motley Crue and Ozzy Osbourne and that's not nice music. They're talking about dark things and Dungeons and Dragons and all this other stuff. A lot of the bands I'm going to mention, I listen to on a daily basis. The media was also getting involved. They had linked a case in Michigan. The 16-year-old James Dallas Egbert III was discovered to be missing from his dorm in Michigan State University. So they found him a few days later. Before he left a suicide note, and he happened to be playing D&D. People don't know who D&D or what D&D is. Dungeons and Dragons, pretty much a game that's imagination driven. You're given like the start of a story, and you and your friends take off with the story using rules that either a book or somebody you've appointed to direct it. Most 80s kids have played Dungeons and Dragons. It is completely harmless and something you can do with literally a book, a paper, and a pencil, and 4 friends. But he had written a suicide note, but in his character, his D&D character's name, and then he took off and went missing, and then they found him. He did end up committing suicide, but he had other problems. I mean, D&D was probably the thing that was maybe keeping him a little stable, being able to live in that imaginary world for a minute and escape of what is going on in his head, because he was schizophrenic and probably bipolar, pretty depressed. So it probably wasn't the fantasy of D&D that drove him to commit suicide, but he did. A private investigator that was hired by his parents believed that it was due to foul play, and they blamed the game and the game creators, saying that he lived in the fantasy world of D&D and couldn't escape it, and they couldn't distinguish real from fake. Call bullshit.
Yeah.
This is hysteria also affected, I've mentioned music quite a few times, but it also affected hard rock and heavy metal bands. They were being sued because
Yeah.
if their fans listened to them and happened to commit suicide, families were suing them, saying that it was their fault because of their lyrics or subliminal messages.
That's
Two of,
crazy.
two of the most probably remembered cases was of Judas Priest being sued and Ozzy Osbourne. Now, I remember the Ozzy Osbourne interview with him talking about this, and he pretty much was like, dude, I don't even know what the fuck a subliminal message is, let alone how to put it in my song. And I believe him because Ozzy in the 80's probably was a little bit too fucked up to even think about putting something like that in a song to get kids to do something. Why would he give a shit? He's too busy snoring fucking ants with Motley Crue. But that was the type of mentality. It was any link whatsoever to something bad was driving that narrative of Satan's here, he's after your kids. Look, Ozzy is leading them to him. Pretty much what they were saying.
That's
And
crazy.
also in the 80's, a release of a book called Michelle Remembers. It was released. It was about sessions between Michelle and her psychologist or psychiatrist, who later became her husband. The claim was that Michelle was abused by the Church of Satan, that this was supposedly a worldwide cult or religion or church that had been a church since, the beginning of time. They supposedly, and all of this has been discredited, that these practices are no longer used and pretty much deemed as laughable, that it was ever considered as science. But the psychiatrist would hypnotize her and she would recall past memories. This has all been debunked as science and proven that you can plant memories if somebody's being hypnotized and kind of like make up your own story of what you wanted to happen. She
That's
said in one of
scary.
these recalled memories that her mother held her and made her participate in an 81-day ritual in 1955 that they supposedly summoned Satan himself. Like I said, you would think an archangel would have a little bit more things to do than to be worried about. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's got all the time in the world, can do whatever the hell he wants. But you think he's got a job to do? You think managing hell would be a big thing. You don't think he can just leave whenever he wants, like punches a time clock. You think if it was that, and if you think it was that easy for like an archangel just to leave a station, that he was. I mean, if you believe the Christian Bible in that story that God banished him to hell, you would think God would have a passcode on that where he can't get out. But that also falls into that the devil's, what was it, that Bible quote, the devil's greatest trick is convincing people that he doesn't exist.
Have I heard that before?
But anyway,
Probably.
that's a whole nother subject and a whole nother conversation. But anyway, you would think even in 1954 and 1955 that this girl who was of school age, that somebody would have noticed her being gone for 81 days.
Right? That's a long time.
Almost 3 months. I mean, what, did they wait to do this ritual until summer vacation? But that's kind of how they debunked the story, is that there was never a time frame that she couldn't be accounted for that long amount of time. But she was saying things like she was being tortured and locked in cages and
Jesus.
sexually assaulted and forced to participate in rituals where she had inhuman sacrifices where she had to rub blood and body parts all over herself. Every bit of it was cited as bullshit, but it took some time. Like, supposedly, she even took her accounts all the way to the Vatican. She was on Oprah.
Oh, really? Wow.
So it wasn't like she wasn't getting her story out. She most definitely was. And you know what happens in this country when people get a fanaticized idea? It becomes a trend.
Yeah.
So she's putting all this crap out saying that she's recalling memories by being hypnotized by her psychiatrist, and people are going and doing this shit. And it's creating false accounts of abuse that never happened. This resulted in satanic ritual abuse cases. The first one, or the earliest one that they could find, was in Kern County, California in 1980 in Bakersfield. Social workers had read Michelle Remembers and learned of this satanic sex cult that existed from the book. So they started coercing children into fabricating or making up stories and claim saying relatives were doing this stuff to them. These claims would send at least 26 people to jail in interrelated convictions, even though there was no evidence. The only evidence they had was coerced accounts from kids saying that it happened. There was no evidence it happened, no cooperation of they weren't even looking into, okay, supposedly this happened at this day and time where this kid would be in school. So if this happened, the kid wouldn't have been in school. They weren't even looking up in the school to see if the kid was in attendance that day to give any credibility to the claims. They're just accepting it, throwing him to jail. There's one man who nearly all of those convictions have been overturned, which included a man who served 20 years of his 40-year sentence to those. And in those, two parents who were sentenced 240 years in prison after their own sons were coached and accused them of abuse. I understand nobody necessarily died in this, but they kind of did. You can't accuse somebody of and make these claims against people and them not be true, because even the accusation ruins somebody's life.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not they were convicted or not, if you accuse somebody and it goes to court and it's known, you did it in the eyes of.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what happens.
You may not be criminally convicted, but you are socially convicted for sure. And 1884. In 1994, Cuban immigrant Frank Foster was accused, along with his undocumented wife, of molesting 8 children. Despite interviews obviously being coercive and there was no evidence or anything like that proved that him and his wife did any of this, they were sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms, or a minimum of 165 years in prison. As of 2021, he hasn't been in prison for over 35 years and will not be eligible for parole into 2134. He has no legal representation. So they know that it's bullshit. They know he didn't do it, but there's nobody to advocate for this guy. Could we get some pro bono lawyer out there to help this guy out, please?
Right,
I mean, seriously.
That's crazy.
And as bad as that sentence and that situation is, he's not the only one. There's an inmate. Okay, so in North Carolina, there is a 72-year-old man still serving time for a 1992 conviction of coerced allegations of ritualistic. And there's also another man in Ohio that's been serving time since 1994 for a highly bizarre case in which he was convicted of ritualistic child abuse, along with another woman, even though the two had never met, and she was later exonerated. It kind of goes on and on. There's another one in Florida that spent 21 years in there, he was released after 21 years of false satanic ritual accusations.
That is messed up. That's such a long time.
For it to be known that it was all bullshit, and they don't just review the case.
Right.
That's crazy. But also, I mean, there's tons of them. In 1984, 3 members of the Emerald family in Malden, Massachusetts, were also convicted of assaulting their children through a false memory coercion. So they hypnotized the kids, suggested it, and then got the false memory. They were exonerated in 1998 after one of the parents that was convicted of it died. So she died in prison before. There was, in 1997, 4 lesbian women who became known as the San Antonio Four were targeted and wrongfully convicted for child molestation claims. Their trial played out against a resurgence of satanic panic tied to homophobia in the conservative state. This is where it's kind of not just the satanic panic of the 80s, because it did not stop. You think back any time the moral majority didn't like where mainstream culture was going, it was labeled them as child molestation, or that group would get that label. They're deviant, so they must be like this too, was usually the narrative that was driven towards homosexuals, which is just crazy to think that.
Yeah.
Probably one of the most notorious criminal cases, and probably one of the most remembered, was the West Memphis 3.
Oh,
where,
yeah. I remember that.
Where they were pretty much accused just because they were goth kids. There was no evidence, and those kids did time. Nothing that's actually proven. It's all finger pointing and gossip, which is very close to the Salem Witch trials, where people died. You're pretty much killing these people too when you're imprisoning for 20 years and labeling them as child predators. That whole, and it's still going on. There was a theory that was tied to, so the most damaging effects of the Satanic Panic of the 80s was felt pretty much within the legal system, of the cost of trying all of these cases, and then all these people getting exonerated and they were in prison, and just the cost of that alone was probably the biggest part of it. But there's ramifications of it that still are in effect today. Something that people don't even really think about. But that little parental advisory sticker that's on your CD, well, people don't buy CDs anymore, but
that's so wild to think about, that people don't even buy CDs.
But explicit content that you still see, like if you're on iTunes or Apple Music or Spotify or any of that, the fact that it has a tag that it's explicit is the side effect of the Satanic Panic. During the same time, how they went after the rock bands, as if they talked about graphic, explicit material, that they had to have that sticker on it that told people that they were saying bad words. The argument against that was, this is art, and you're asking us to either change our art or to label it, which isn't fair. The fact that movies have ratings, rated mature or whatever, that all stemmed from the Satanic Panic, and so people could identify, that's bad, watch that. I knew about that. I actually got really interested in how that happened and stuff like that, but I never connected it with all of the other things, like the Ozzy being sued over the fans committing suicide, and it goes on and on. Like, literally, it never stopped. If you think about it, the creepy clown hoax of 2016, people just standing in people's backyard.
I forgot all about that.
That is kind of like another form of keeping that narrative going. The devil's real, and he's in your backyard, and he's going to get you. Recent things that have happened that kind of, it's another way that it's cited that narrative is being driven. But do you remember the Pizzagate thing?
The what?
Where there was a conspiracy theory, a right-wing conspiracy theory that actually resulted into a lot of serious threats and serious accusations, and elements of Satanic Panic. But Pizzagate, which led to a believer bringing a gun to a Washington, D.C. pizza parlor in 2016 and held that a Democratic politician was secretly trafficking children for sex, holding them in the basement of the pizza place. By the way, the pizza place doesn't have a basement. Saying that this pizza place was sex trafficking children through its basement. Completely unfounded, but same thing. They walked in there and it became a big thing. People got arrested. Also in 2016, a right-wing conspirator interpreted a dinner party held by performance artist Marina Abramovich to be a satanic ritual. Details of the dinner party was leaked in emails by a former campaign chair of Hillary Clinton. Although the theory was kind of crazy, Abramovich has faced allegations that she is a practicing Satanist ever since. And in 2020, an enraged conspiracy theorist disrupted and shut down a collaboration she was working on with Microsoft. That theory was tied to Pizzagate, and that it was also politicized and involved the idea that the Democratic politicians were secretly engaged in evil acts, given the polarized U.S. political climate. So pretty much they were trying to link this pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. that was supposedly sex trafficking children out of a basement that did not exist to a performance artist, wasn't a Satanist, that was interpreted as a Satanist, somehow got mashed together into the idea that there was Democratic politicians that were engaged in evil acts, such as child abuse and human trafficking. In 2017, so we're going back in time now, there was an anonymous 4chan user. His handle Q. He began claiming that he had insider knowledge about a vast satanic pedophile ring involving Democrats and high-powered celebrities, including Donald Trump, and that they were trafficking children and harvesting hormones to make serums that provide eternal youth. The conspiracy quickly became known as QAnon, the name for both the theory and the followers of the Q dude that was on. You may have fallen kind of victim to this mentality as well, because he was pretty good at hiding the narrative on Facebook with hashtag Save the Children.
Oh, gosh.
So pretty much was saying that this was a part of a sex trafficking ring that was being masked by people believing that it was an anti-sex trafficking ring. Who knows what was going on with that? That was a whole lot of confusion. But pretty much, when you start going down this rabbit hole, it's showing how little accusations, especially when it gets linked in the media and it's attached to somebody that's well known or could possibly be well known, how it can get blown up into something that can do real damage.
Yeah.
Happened in Salem, happened in the 80's, and throughout even recent history, it's happening again. Now, there has been evidence brought to light that there really was an affluent sex trafficking ring with the dude that supposedly had the island, or like Donald Trump and like all these famous people were going.
Epstein?
Yeah, that dude.
I don't really know much about it, but the name, I know the name now.
There's evidence that was real, or there's evidence that that is real. That people are going to jail on that, and there really was a sex trafficking ring that was trafficking children, and there was a ritual surrounding it. So,
well, that's horrible.
Maybe there was a grain of truth that was in there, but because they kept associating it with the people that were flat out lying about it, it was a way to cover it up. Kind of like a smoke and mirrors thing. We have them looking over here, but really we're doing it over here.
Mm-hmm.
Which is horrible and terrifying to think about if that's really going on. But it's kind of scary also, the way cancel culture is going.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that's out of hand.
you can almost not say anything and be in trouble. I'm pretty sure we've said about 12 things in this podcast that's going to piss people off, especially because we're
Probably.
talking about Satanism and the moral majority and stuff like that. People have to remember history. I mean, the 80's wasn't all that long ago. I mean, I hate to admit that it was over 40 years ago. And if that could generate people actually ruining people's lives, go back even further in history. You have Salem, England. They did the same thing. This is that history repeats itself thing, where you guys got to pay attention. You can't just be blindly blaming people or accusing people of being things. It can actually hurt people. It can drive that mob mentality to not only
a dangerous height.
Right, and change things in a way that you probably aren't intending. Because I highly doubt, the moral majority thought that they were going to be imprisoning innocent people by driving this narrative that the devil is real. They just didn't want people giving it attention. I understand that, but they lied. And cancel culture is pretty much the same thing. It's twisting. Like I seen something recently, James Hetfield of Metallica. You guys that weren't there and didn't understand the culture of the time aren't going to understand that when he said certain things, it wasn't considered racist or offensive at the time. You were just being edgy. So nowadays they're looking at it as through a lens of today, of the way you can't say things like that today. We know better today. We didn't know better back then.
And you can't change what you did back then, so...
Right. And not necessarily don't hold them accountable. Of course, question them.
You're right.
But blame, point fingers, or accuse of being part of something that could potentially harm somebody just because they're famous or well known doesn't mean something really bad can't happen to them. That man still has kids. This is still his livelihood. And I don't know if anybody else has ever been 20, but I ran my mouth a whole lot over stupid shit in my 20s.
Yeah, me too.
I'm glad there wasn't a TikTok or a Facebook or any of that crap when we were 20. Can you imagine?
No.
There's some stories that I know that we are so glad that there's no video evidence of.
Yep, none at all. Like, what? That didn't happen.
What are you talking about?
Oh, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and hit that little bell to get notified every time we upload. Look out for next week's episode about urban legends. And until next time, bye.
Bye.